I think Simon's example of the youth employment issue, there was no shock in that example that I saw. It was just youth challenges, vulnerabilities, poverty, but it was an employment program with an employment outcome that you would measure in a pretty standard way. So the difference in my mind here, if you took that example, would be if you're looking at youth employment and you're looking at economic shocks to northern Uganda because of conflict in South Sudan, how would you do your training program different knowing that those are coming? Subtle distinction, but I think it's important. So the way that we are applying this is essentially geared towards helping us narrow down that laundry list by saying there are certain things that if I possess them, if a community possesses them, if a system possesses them, that will maintain some state of good, well-being outcome, put in there what you like, if it's nutrition or psychosocial well-being or health or ecological health. But in the end, there's certain capacities that are linked to those in the face of a shock. And that's, to me, where we're at as a field. Less about impact measurement and more of a diagnostic on which horses do we back. So this is a good example I use. This is one of Mercy Corps' own programs of why it's important to include shocks in our measurement. So here we've got a program. It was labeled as resilience building for food security. We've got a decent theory of change that says if we build productive livelihood options and collective community action, that will sustainably increase food security. And we've got our good indicators, and we can do our nice impact evaluation design and attribute changes to all of those. And in this case, we actually did see change that was attributable. But then if you click again, so again, the distinction between that as a food security program and as a resilience program around food security would be, okay, do changes in household dietary diversity continue, or are they quickly maintained in the face of a drought in, this was the drylands of Myanmar. So again, subtle distinction, but if we don't do that, let's not call it resilience. So as Mercy Corps, we went in fairly early days after things opened up in the South in early 2012. To do what was planned to be just a food security analysis, and we decided to try to do some analysis around a lot of the assumptions that we assumed had contributed to resilience to the complex crisis in 2010 and 11. Now again, there was a laundry list, and that's what's on the left side. We've organized these into Chris's very nice categories of different types of capacities, but in the end here, there's quite a number of different assumptions we were making that certain households fared better during that crisis than others. Some managed to maintain or quickly recover some of those outcomes. And so we're trying to understand which of those characteristics really did make a difference given sort of similar exposure to the shocks. And this was based on just some cross-sectional analysis, but within the shocks themselves, I don't think we did a great job of being able to get objective measures of them. So it very much was trying to get self-report, as we discussed this morning, in terms of levels of exposure. But we were able to basically say, we make some similarities between the severity or levels of exposure to shocks, including drought, conflict, and other market shocks there. And then the analysis, if you go to the next slide, basically starts to tell us not what works, but in this case, out of that long list, what are the factors that actually have, in this case, just strong linkages to enabling people to maintain or recover food security in the face of the crisis. So here you've got a bit of it's cut off, but essentially, factors that were significantly related to less distressful coping on the right-hand side, or more distressful coping on the left. And if you flip to the next slide, what it does is it helps to reconfirm things that we already know. For example, in the Somalia context, we found that extended social networks, enable people to maintain household dietary diversity more than others who didn't have as strong of those networks. You can go to the next slide. We found that it disconfirmed some of our assumptions around, for example, livelihood diversity. There's a big assumption in resilience work that more income sources is better because it spreads risk. In the magnitude of that shock, turns out it doesn't really matter how many income sources you have, and other studies have pointed to it's more about the independence of those livelihood sources that spread risk to different kinds of shocks. So that's a good pushback on some common thinking that we have. And then other things came up that we didn't assume would make a difference at all, but kind of threw in there because we were curious. So for example, female involvement in household decisions turned out to enable those households to maintain greater food security levels than similar households that didn't have that involvement. And we have reasons that, we think that might be, but we count on smart people like Dan Maxwell to go in and do good qualitative work to tell us. Again, the point is, we are going from a sort of a long list of assumptions to here's a few we can confirm and program around. So let's see what we can do to support the kind of social capital that we found people had relied on. Let's not invest in household diversity of the typical kind that showed not to make much difference, et cetera. So I think that's the starting point to start to come into a clearer sense of, again, what are good candidates in that long list and what aren't. So then now just onto the shocks bit, because I realized I was meant to talk to that, but I thought it would be helpful to work through a full example. If you just want to flip to the last slide. Can I tell me how much time I have? Perfect. Okay. One more slide. Okay. So I think the challenges around looking at shocks in particular are at least three. On the collection side, we talked about already the limitations of self-reported measures around shocks. Another one really is that when we go and do, especially in situations where there's not a major shock, I think we talked about that a lot this morning, where we've got 1 year or a 3-year program and there wasn't a catastrophe, thank you. So how can we say something about resilience? So in this case, we're getting better at picking up on smaller scale, isolated incidents, a localized flood or a severe dispute in a certain area, and being able to sample around those populations. So if you go in and take a big cross-section in a survey, you won't pick up on much of that. But if you think about your trigger indicators and say, okay, we're going to follow up with some surveys in areas that were affected, then we can start to understand how they were impacted and do some of this frequent surveying that Mark was talking about to understand if and how they recover and how our programs may be helping with that. So that's a kind of an innovation, I think, around the collection side that helps us get a little better. The other is just use of good secondary data. So we are kind of triangulating with, I didn't think it was a drought as a farmer, but the Met says it is. And so what are the programming implications there? On the analysis side, I think there's something to, to caution against that we've made the mistake of doing, which is, we're talking about multiple shocks. It's rarely one thing, and Somalia is, kind of case in point. It's the tendency is to create a nice shock index, and you have the more, the worse, and put that in your analysis. But we understand pretty well that there's different responses to different types of shocks, and there's different capacities that are likely to support. So, for market shocks, it helps to be insulated from the market. So subsistence farming would be a good capacity to reinforce. If it's a drought, market access is probably a good thing, so you can sell off livestock, access grains. So those are two very different, again, programming implications. So analyzing these determinants or capacities separate for different shocks makes sense in most cases. On the use side, I actually have no idea. Yeah, I think that one kind of speaks to itself. It's more of the policy side of, okay, then what do we do with this? So I'd be really curious to hear feedback from you all in terms of, if we apply these models and we come out with similar results like this, are they helpful? Do they help you with the kind of the so what questions that you struggle with? I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot for that. Can I just ask before I start that people send their questions before the yellow card, because in the last round I missed a really good question because it came in too late. Okay, so a mixed bag of questions here, which is quite interesting. So I couldn't really cluster them all, so I'm going to pick some of them randomly. See, we've just missed another really good question because it came in after the yellow card. So the questions I'm going to ask are you suggesting that we do a follow-up assessment after each minor shock?
I think where we know that those are significant recurrent events that we don't have a handle on, and we talked this morning about the political shocks in particular, we're still just learning there. So I think if we can go and do some really focused sampling and surveying around some conflict incidences and look at the kind of aftermath of that and how our programs interact, yes, I wouldn't say we want to do that across the board. You're selective to build understanding.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question was, how is household survey education part of absorptive capacity?
Come again?
It was a typo. Household education. I did wonder about that. How is
it?
Yeah.
Oh, you're questioning the categorization? Oh.
I'm just reading the question as it came.
Yeah, I won't defend where they said it.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. And I think we'll try and get a last one out of this last question here that looks very interesting. How do we define shocks? Is a summary of the question. At different levels.
Oh, is your question? I mean, we had a discussion this morning. There's probably a fine line, especially with the slow onsets, between a stress and a shock. In some cases there may be thresholds that are agreed upon that now it's a drought, now it's a famine. Those are out there. I think it's kind of arbitrary in terms of our analysis of it, though. I think if we want to get a nice continuous measure, then it would really help to understand where we draw the line between when it becomes a shock. Other than for trigger action, I think that's a different purpose. But in the case of just understanding the relationships between these different sets of factors, that line is not as important to me. Look, it helps. I mean, with the shock there, that's really clear and discrete. That's when this stuff is easier. And personally, we've been fairly opportunistic to say, let's take advantage of that to be able to learn something. Even when we don't, we didn't have programs in South Somalia when we went in there. We just, we were looking at assumptions. Same in the Philippines now. So, yeah.
Can I just make a remark on this? Because I think it's important when you think about shocks. There's reasons why you want to disaggregate the shocks people are exposed to so you can figure out what to do about them and how they actually manage each of those things. But you also want to understand how all of the shocks together combine to affect households and communities as well. So so when we create like an indice around a shock index or a shock exposure index, that kind of tells us how big the severity of the problem is for that household or community. Because it's real important to know the difference between somebody that's responding to a less severe set of shocks than those that are responding to a very big set of shocks, and then trying to say those are, one's more resilient than the other. Well, they're not exposed to the same things. Okay, so it's very important to take that into account. But to be able to do something about it, you have to disaggregate. So there's reasons why we aggregate, and there's reasons why we disaggregate. And that's why it's important to depending on how you're going to program, or you want to know something about